Now, some DAST tools out there will identify, and especially the new stuff, especially even the AI-driven new stuff,
Yeah.
has some really good automation behind it where it can find out, hey, you did something new. It takes a look at your APIs, it takes a look at your different things, and then it can make better decisions based off of that from an automation standpoint. The reason why a lot of people, and I said this at the beginning, a lot of people try to avoid it or they just don't want to do it, is because it is so heavy and intensive throughout the whole process. But again, it's like that QA automation. They have to do the same thing. They have to go in, they have to build that automation to test the new stuff that's going through. And once it's done and in production, they have to do it similar to you in your DAST.
Welcome to the season 3 of The Elephant in AppSec, the podcast to explore, challenge, and boldly face the AppSec elephants in the room. I'm Alexandra, your host and AppSec enthusiast and growth manager at Escape. Today, I'm joined by Chris Lindsey, who at the time of recording was an AppSec Evangelist at Ment. Formerly an AppSec Architect, Chris brings over 15 years of direct security experience and more than 35 years of leadership in programming software and security architecture. For several years, Chris built and led an entire application security program, including oversight of security processes, procedures, tools, compliance, training, developer communication, and risk analysis. Chris also is a seasoned speaker and the host of the Secrets of AppSec Champions podcast. In this episode, we discuss why many still view DAST as a checkbox rather than a critical component of security, and how that perspective is changing, especially with the rise of modern DAST tools. We'll also explore how to strategically integrate DAST with other tools in your AppSec program. If you agree with Chris that we need to stop treating DAST like a dessert, this episode is for you. If you enjoy this podcast, don't forget to subscribe and follow it on your favorite podcasting app or YouTube. It's the best way to avoid missing future episodes. And with that, get ready to hear Chris' opinions. Dive right in! Hi, Chris. I'm super excited to have you on the podcast today with me. Well, thank you so much for joining. I guess, it might be a little bit tough, as I understood, to get back into the proper rhythm, at least for you after the holidays. You mentioned you had some ups and downs, if you can say that. But yeah, I'm really excited, and I'm actually excited about the topic today that we discussed, before. You recently published an article on it. I recently published an article on it. So it's kind of very fresh still, I would say, in our mind. And yeah, you mentioned, I think your article is called Don't Treat DAST as a Dessert, like
Right.
dessert. Right, because I think, well, it shouldn't be, at least. I mean, desserts are usually delicious and everyone wants a piece of that, but not often, necessary. At least that's the idea, I guess, you tried to convey with your article, right? But these, often end up, as afterthought because of that. And a lot of people, I think, that I've talked with recently, to interview about this topic for my article, they kind of saw it as a checkbox or something, to put in their application security program and just, because they have to, which is not maybe the best approach. And and I think you also mentioned that, but why do you think, this perception still exists in the community? Because, well, was it also your experience? Because you were also an AppSec engineer for really a long time, right?
So so first off, thank you for having me here today. I'm glad to be here, and this is going to be a great conversation. I ran a security program for over 3 years, and DAST was actually part of my security program because I understood the benefits that it would bring to the application security wheel of security that I ran. And having DAST in there, a lot of people, as mentioned in my article, really kind of think of DAST as kind of an afterthought because when they're out there, they start looking at DAST, it's easy to go, look it up, and you're going to see a lot of people saying, oh, DAST is really hard. It doesn't have any payback. It's very minimal at best. Why would you go spend a lot of effort? Because it really does take a lot of fine tuning and a lot of work to get it up and going. And so why would you bother doing it? Yeah, I mean, 3 years, is quite a long time, especially when you focus on that. Like, was there, when you ran it, like, how did you proceed? What was it already when you started, or did you actually, had to
fight, internally to have that?
So actually, I'm a little bit different. Let me share one thing real quick, and then I'll get into that. And honestly, it went really well for me. I built a program from the ground up. My background, I wrote software for 35 years, and so my background being development, I understand how developers think, how they work, because I was one of them for 35 years. And when I built my program, nothing existed. And so I built it from the ground up. And when I did, I looked at it from a developer's angle versus a normal security angle. I didn't come into running the program with all these certificates and being highly certified and going in and just saying, look, I've got all this. So for me, my thinking was, how would I do this if I were running my development? And of the 35 years, at least close to 30 was actually in healthcare. And my last application was a medication prescribing system. And because of that, you have to be secure. Otherwise, people are going to be able to make their own medications, their own scripts. They're stealing data. What kind of diagnosis or allergies do people have? Because it's important to the patient, but it's not important outside of that unless you're wanting to market or do something malicious. And so there's a lot more to it. And so building the application program from scratch with that developer angle really gave me kind of a leg up because I knew what developers would be interested in. I knew if I just threw things over the wall, how they would react. And, I knew how to really kind of put something together that actually worked really smoothly.
And with 35 years, for development experience, I imagine, there were tools that security team imposed on you that you kind of hated or weren't there?
So actually, the crazy part is out of my entire career, I never had a security team. That what I worked with. And so I didn't know realistically. Now we had security network, server, all those, absolutely, but not from an application security standpoint. And so to me, it was all fresh and all new. And the questions that I asked myself is, where do I start and how to get rolling? Because back when I did this, it was 6-ish years ago. The problem is we didn't have the communications or the shares or the podcasts that we do today, where we're actually out there, sharing the good news and sharing how to do things. And so, some things were out there, but it was very quiet because companies didn't want to share. And because they didn't want to share, you just kind of had to go on your own and look at security vendors and see what they had to offer. And they would always, show the shiny stuff and, hey, we've got this and this and this. But when you looked at it from a development standpoint, I was always very focused on asking the question, is it a fit? And not only is it a fit, but is it something my developers would use as well? And so when I looked at it from that angle, it really changed everything about the tools that I brought in, because findings for finding's sake means nothing. Because if you don't have anything actionable, anything that you can deal with and focus on to actually make yourself more secure, why would you have it? Why would you go spend the money?
And what do you think should be, the points on which security engineers should focus that would actually bring value for developers?
So there's a lot that is out there that bring value to the developers. Back in the old days, we didn't really update our dependencies. And, you would go out there, you would find something. I need a file uploader. All right, you find one, you plug it in, right? Or I need a logging mechanism, Log4j, be it .NET or, Log4j.NET or the Java version, whatever, right? So you go find it, you plug it in, it works. Or you spin up your own. But the reality is it was painful to go out and ask the question once or twice a year, we probably should update this, right? With maybe new features, new functionality. But if it's not broke, why would you change it?
I mean, quite often that's the phrase that is, if it's not broke, why would you change it?
Exactly. So, for me, that's how we ran things back in the 90s, the 2000s, the early 2000s, and even mid 2000s, kind of up until about 2015, 2016. And that's when we started realizing, hey, security is a lot more than just the basics. Now, I was always very security minded with APIs, with everything, because of how important it was to make sure that the data was safe. And so I always had an eye on security, but we never really had tools or anything out there. And really our big thing is, hey, the libraries are fine. Well, we've since learned that they're not. And when I brought a tool in and looked at it from an SCA standpoint, I was surprised, very, very surprised. And so we implemented it, got it across the board, and we, chipped away at our debt. But the reality is there are tools out there that allow you to just keep updated on your dependencies. And the question that SCA brings is there vulnerabilities? Well, what do you do with an SCA tool? It tells you to update, right? So if you stay updated, now you've removed a lot of your vulnerabilities, but the reality still out there, is your tertiary, your indirect dependencies. Because as we know, most libraries out there use other open source libraries, and sometimes you have 3, 4, 5, 6 deep. So.
Okay, and how, within the application security program, you mentioned the SCA tools, there is also SAST. How do you make sure that all of the tools, for example, work together well, together with DAST that we talked about, in the beginning, that you can actually, take all of them together and derive the most value, not just like a chaos, all over the place result.
Right. So the way that you can make your developers upset is simply going in and blocking the build. Going out there, putting it in the pipeline, blocking the whole thing, right? And making them wait. We had some applications that would take 9 hours to scan for some of the tools out there. For others, they were much quicker. And that was before you added DAST. And so, today's tools are a lot faster than they were back when I ran my program, but, hopefully. And
I mean, that's the goal,
Right.
So many people that use very old tools.
They still do. They still do. But the reality is, if you can find a way to kick the tools off at commit, now you've changed the whole paradigm. When you can actually kick the scans off when they committed the code to the repository, and you can figure out where a good spot is. Certain things like SAST and SCA, every developer check-in. And you're going to have, I've had people argue up and down with me, oh, that's excessive. But how is it excessive? Because you go from a developer from writing feature code into an integration branch, which then you test against everybody else that's writing code. And then you go into the QA and on up into production. And if you can catch your stuff at the time that you create it, now it gives you the chance to fix it before you start, pushing it up the chain. And when you start looking at DAST, that's the kind of the same thing. Now, DAST is a lot heavier. So DAST isn't going to be a tool that you're going to sit there and go, hey, I'm going to run this on every commit. As a developer, you sit there and I always laugh about building a house. If a developer built a house, they would go out there, especially CSS front-end developers, right? Hey, that house looks good, but I need to push it over 3 feet. Let me bring it back a foot. Let me make it a half foot. And they sit there and they tweak it, with the CSS and pixels and everything until it looks right. And the reality is when you look at your tools that way, you're sitting there committing and committing and committing. That doesn't work well for some tools like DAST, because some DASTs tools can run really quick, but most of them take time, especially the ones if you're doing full scan. And so, one way to look at DAST is kind of like your QA team, right? They're going to run a full regression, run that full regression with DAST at that same time, because it's really, in a lot of ways, it's kind of like a QA tool, because it validates, did I break anything? Do I have any bugs? Do I have anything bad? And your QA person that's doing the QA, they can block the build if you've introduced anything terrible. And if it didn't exist before, now you have the ability to fix it, to do something about it and make better progress. On the flip side, you don't want to run DAST on every commit.
Yeah, I think that's indeed the feedback that I heard quite a lot is about, firstly about long scanning times. I had this conversation with James Bertotti, and he used to use Qualys before, and he told me it takes 12 hours to run a single scan. I don't know if you worked, with Qualys personally, but that's...
I have used Qualys in the past.
Yeah, so that was kind of the key frustration, apart from the results, but that was the important part. And I think the second part that I hear now more and more is the requirement for maintenance. And that is another why it's very hard to run it, on every commit. Like you mentioned, is that because you have to, if the application logic changes in a lot of tools, like let's say Zap, you have to write a new test for it, and you have to change the logic of applications, because all tests become obsolete, and it's very hard. So I think that's, I don't know if in your experience you also had, that feeling that, oh my God, if I have to, have to change so much again and again and again. Do you think like this part is actually something that also is very difficult to do?
It can be. I mean, if you think about it, right? The purpose of writing software is to create something new. And you can create that new thing, but if you don't tell your tools about it, like your DAST, how's it going to know? Now, some DAST tools out there will identify, and especially the new stuff, especially even the AI-driven new stuff, has some really good automation behind it where it can find out, hey, you did something new. It takes a look at your APIs, it takes a look at your different things, and then it can make better decisions based off of that from an automation standpoint. But you're absolutely right. And DAST is a tool. The reason why a lot of people, and I said this at the beginning, a lot of people try to avoid it or they just don't want to do it, is because it is so heavy and intensive throughout the whole process. But again, it's like that QA automation. They have to do the same thing. They have to go in, they have to build that automation to test the new stuff that's going through. And once it's done and in production, they have to do it similar to you in your DAST. Your QA person may have access to the DAST and maybe that's part of their job is managing DAST as far as that goes, or the developer or whoever. Most of the time I tried to have development involved as far as doing the initial pieces, and then the security team would review them before we actually blessed it and went forward. And that just kind of goes back to it's just an extra step during the development process. I wrote something that's going to break it, or I have something that I've added in. I'm going to make the changes or at least notify the security guys so that when they do the initial scan, they can make sure that it's covered. And then once it's there, then you're moving forward. Security is really kind of like a football game, right? You've got a whole team of people that it requires to get something done. The quarterback can't do everything himself. He can't block, he can't pass to himself. It requires a team and teamwork. And that's really kind of how security is, especially when you start looking at things like DAST.
Yeah, I think for sure security is a team sport in itself, and security and development are two teams kind of fighting each other on the football field, and I'm not sure if it's for the win of one, but it should be a more joint effort, because you mentioned, I think, that you argued, right? Sometimes with some engineers. Do you have like an example of the argument that you won?
Right. So the arguments that you typically will hear from the developers, and this is any security program has heard this, right? And, it was one that I would have once in a while, a couple teams. You always had that team or those teams that really weren't bought in. And it's the concept of a false positive. And they come back to you, all those are not true. All these are false. All these are, and I'm full of stories. So I'm going to share the story with you. And it was me actually helping another company out with their SAST results. And they came to me and said, hey, our developers don't think that SAST brings any value. And I said, well, let me see your tool. And I had signed NDAs and all this, and we brought every developer on to a call. And the very first thing that I did is I opened it up. I was looking through the tool and I identified some of the things. I said, oh, look, cross-site script injection, right? Great. Oh, SQL injection. And this one I landed on, and it was obvious because it was a request parameter across the top where it was ID equals something. It literally was concatenation into the string. So it was your standard definition, your actual definition of a SQL injection. So what I did with them is I asked the group that was on, which was over 70, thumbs up if you think it's good, thumbs down if you think it's a false positive. And anyway, everybody said it was a false positive. And so I said, okay, well then I opened up Notepad, dropped in the URL, and I said $ID equals 5, semicolon, truncate table. And had I run it, it would have destroyed their system. Now, what I did is I put it in Notepad and I opened up Chrome and I highlighted it and I went back to the chat. Well, I said, hey, put it in chat. If you still think this is a true, if you think this is a true positive or false positive, let me know. Otherwise, if you think it's real, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to run this. And this guy comes out, stop. And he goes, all right. And we read that it was actually a finding. And so what happens is you get the developers into a mindset where they feel like everything is a false positive. And so now they lose faith in the tools. And when they lose faith in the tools and in the security team, you're sunk until you have something like this. So I walk through that with this group, hey, this is what it would do, and I'll walk through the code. And when you explain it, it changes everything. And that's why you'll hear me say frequently, it's always important to have a developer on the security team. And the reason why is because if a developer's on the team, security team, they can walk through and explain things exactly like I just did to this company. And the problem is the security team that was out there couldn't get the developers on board, and there was never a developer on the security team. And so that explanation just never existed. And once you get that explanation out there, great. Now, the concept of a false positive, really the tools are there to find something. And it's like going out there and using regular expressions or different things. And you say, hey, look, I've got a document, right? Let's say a Word document, Control F, I want to find the word the or something. And it finds it. That's all security tools are designed to do, really for the most part, is to find something. Now, when it finds that something, the question becomes, is it important to you or not? Because if it's not, people throw out it's false positive. But the reality is it's a finding. It's just like doing a Control F on a Word doc, right? It finds what it's designed to do. And if it's a command injection and you're on a command line utility, like on Linux command line, at the bash shell or whatever, does command injection mean anything? No, you're already at the command line, right? Or PowerShell or wherever. But on the flip side, if that happens on a web server and it's not intended to have user interaction, it's terrible. It's a bad thing to have.
And when do you think like too many false positives is, too many? I'll be honest, because at one point, I mean, even if it's finding, it can become, too much,
Right.
much. At least that's what I heard, as well about DAST. It's like a vicious circle when you have to continuously manually update tool. If you don't update tool, it gives you too many false positive, and then you lose, as you mentioned, you lose faith in it. So it's like when too much is, is too much.
Right. So with DAST, the thing that I like about DAST is a lot of the tools out there will show you how it came to believe that this was a finding. And DAST has a low false positive rate compared to SAST. SAST, again, finding rate, right? So here I am. There's no such thing as a false positive. Bam, now I'm using false positive. But the reality is the findings that you have with DAST are typically ones that are actionable and important to look at. And the reality is you may have a lot because it could just be a simple, terrible application. We had an application once that I worked on as far as from a security side, not from a development side. And the thing was so chock full of problems that we put it on its own island. Because at a certain point, you look at it and you ask the question, can this be mitigated through, does it require code changes, or can it be mitigated through other means? And that's something that most people don't think about. That magical, WAF or that magical F5 or wherever, you have some capability to go in there and you can say, look, we have so many findings that it's going to take time to chip away at them. And so you got to figure out the prioritization. And what I would typically do is over the summer, I would always bring in an intern. And we would look at our tools and we would look at the worst case scenarios. What could compromise us the easiest? What could be the worst thing that happens? That was always the question. What is the worst thing that could happen? And then we ran after it. We looked at it from a code standpoint, from the security side, and these were developers that were also doing security in college, and so they were interns, but they were always looking at the worst case things that were out there, the command injections, the command executions, the whatevers. And so then we took that, and that was our prioritization, starting from the worst and then just kind of chipping away at it and down. And so you would basically say your criticals down to your highs down. And so we did that. And not only did we go in and look at it from a code standpoint and ask the question, can this be done? But then we took Burp Suite and said, can we do it? So we actually not only just looked at the code and asked the question, but we followed through with an actual, just a very focused pen test. And when we could do something against it, then we recorded that, we shared it with the developers, and now they have something actionable. And I call it pulling the fire alarm. And what that means is when I ran my program, I would not bring everybody together for a hot fix unless it was absolutely critical. And I only had to do this twice. We found things, we worked with the teams, we worked with the software architects, we made sure that they were always in the loop. But if I found something so bad that this was a showstopper, That's what I call pulling the fire alarm. And so at that moment, twice did I ever have to do that in, when I ran my program, and that was Log4j, as we all
Okay,
know.
makes sense.
We all did that, and that was company wide. And we were so well tuned as what we were doing that we were actually mitigated and completely in a good spot in less than 12 hours from the
Oh wow.
time we found it, which
Okay.
was early in the morning. We were done by midnight. And that was, I can't
That's
share how
pretty
much
quick.
code.
I don't know how large was the organization?
Extremely large. We had over
Okay.
85 teams that
Okay.
report, and several hundred, I think it was 700 plus developers. So it was a lot. It was
Okay.
big, and not everything was Java. So
Mhm.
not everything was impacted, but we knew we had the tools, we had
Right.
everything in place. And so we were able to identify and deal with it in a timely manner. And the other was actually just an application that we identified something terrible and we notified them. And it was just kind of a small thing, but I never really had to, do a, hey, all hands on deck, we got to do a hot fix, except for twice. So.
But I think in this case, do you think it also helped in a way that your organization was quite mature? Oh, I'm assuming with 700 people. Actually, not always the case, but at least
Nope,
what
not
no,
secure. No,
it
no,
was
not
not.
mature. Nope.
Okay.
But certain teams were at different levels. We were also acquiring companies quite frequently. And so as we were acquiring companies, we were bringing them into the fold, but I had metrics that we created and we worked off of. And so we knew the goal was quarter over quarter. The idea was a 20% reduction in vulnerability counts. Now, the reality is, as a developer, if you have an application with 10 million lines of code, that's not going to be possible. So you always figure out where to go. And the reality is so many different people who are running programs run these tools and go, hey, look, I've got 4,000 findings. I've got
I
two, I've got two critical, I've got two critical, I've got 17 high and several thousand mediums and tons of lows. And they always throw everything over the wall. Hey, guess what? I found all this. And the problem is your developer team just shuts down and says,
I'm
now,
not gonna do it. It's like
no,
decision
no.
paralysis. So yeah.
Exactly. But on the flip side, when you give them something like the DAST result that has the steps and it's something critical, then you work with them. And I always talk about on certain things when I've talked on podcasts or wherever, it's all about that relationship between the security team and the devs. And when you have the software
Yeah.
architects out there, you have the security team, the guy running the AppSec program, or at least some of the security engineers, call the software architects and say hello. Ask, how are you doing? And this is if you don't have a security champion program. If you have one, it's different.
You're
However,
lucky.
for those, yes, you're lucky. But for those who don't have a security program, call from time to time and just say hello. How are things going? Do you need anything from us? How's the family? Because when you start building that personal relationship, now all of a sudden, when you do have something come up, you reach out to them and you're like, hey, Scott, I have a finding. This is my finding. Can you address it? And you start focusing on your criticals and your highs. Don't send anything else. And if you have a lot of criticals, you start there. And again, identify what's important to you, because as a security team, you know how you're going to get compromised. If you see these out there, some critical vulnerabilities are listed as critical, but if you understand how they're running, the space they're running, what mitigation pieces are around them, that changes everything, because that mitigation makes it no longer critical. But the security tool doesn't know. Security tool is just going to throw it across the wall and go here. And that's part of the thing with DAST, right? You do DAST and dev, everything's allowed. You're not going to have the firewall rules or the WAF or anything that blocks it, just like it does in production. And so when you do have something like a DAST, you do want to have some kind of environment that mimics production, kind of like a UAT, where you can say, look, from a UAT standpoint, we actually have, the firewall, we have the WAF, we have all the different things in place that will guarantee that our findings will match what's in production. Because when you have that, now you know what's really important and you know what you have to focus on.
And do you think, for example, like as you mentioned, you have to think critically, about how to prioritize that as well on your side? Do you think AI will actually replace that part eventually or
You
not?
know, It does a good job. And, the reality is AI can do a lot for you. There's so much promise in AI. We're still, everybody says, hey, AI is maturing. If you look at the hype cycle, we're already on the downslope. But the reality is we're not. We're still in a position where AI is maturing. The AI we have today, keep in mind, it was just really technically kind of mainstream February of last year. So we're not even a year into it. We're barely 11 months into it. And if you look at where we were back in February versus today, it's light years ahead. And when you start looking at where AI is headed right now for the future, that changes everything again, because now in 6 months, what we have today is going to be outdated, because we're going to take that maturity model and chip away at it into a point where you're going to be able to use tools that will go out there and give you good coding suggestions. I still kind of stand by it, and it just depends on when you kind of see this recording. AI is wrong 52% of the time. And it has been, and it continues to be, because of its native design on how it actually does the predictive mathematics behind it. But as we start looking at the different things out there in the technologies and the RAG, and to be able to go in, and I know teams like Google DeepMinds and NVIDIA are working on some really cool technology where they have the ability to ask the question, is this right? Because you, on a branching model, what happens on the predictive model, you come up and you may have 2 or 3 answers that have exactly the same value, and it just randomly picks one. It's like if you go and ask 20 different people, the same question, but 20 times to different people, you're going to get different answers. And that's the problem with AI today. And when you start looking at where they're headed with this, now it's going to ask that question, and it's going to come back with 20 different ones, because it keeps splitting as it finds the mathematical equivalence.
Yeah.
And then it's going to ask the question, which one is right? And it will start putting an actual value on that, and be able to be, according to Google DeepMinds and NVIDIA and Microsoft, you're really right around the 90 percentile of accurate. That's going to be game changing when that comes out.
Yeah. But it's also luxury for very large teams like NVIDIA and Microsoft to actually evaluate the findings.
They've got a little bit more money than you and I.
Yeah, no. Because I think, yeah, so far you just don't have a choice. But indeed, I think within even the past year, even like there are now actual dedicated standalone security tools that just do code remediations depending on the findings.
Right.
And that's, I think that's crazy, like how much within a year it completely changed. And if we come back to DAST, I think one important question I wanted to ask that was kind of coming back from the feedback that I heard is to sum up also our conversation. It's when are not really the question if we need DAST tools, even if I understood you're quite positive about it, but when are they 100% worth the investment?
Let me ask you this: is QA worth the investment?
I am not about to. At least it didn't sound, that the life of QA engineer was very fun. Like at least not.
Well, it's funny, because when you look at the relationship between QA and dev and security and dev, there's a lot of similarities between the two. However, when you look at
backgrounds, okay, yeah.
Look at DAST, it's just like regression testing. And if you think about it as regression testing, it changes everything. Now, the reality is regression testing asks the question, did you break something? DAST, on the other hand, isn't asking, did you break something from a previous standpoint. What you're asking is, did I do something stupid? Did I create a bug? Did I do something, because I didn't know? And the reality is your developers that don't know how to develop clean code are going to continue doing the same thing over and over and over. And so to answer your question, is DAST worth it? It's a heavy uplift. It takes a lot of work. It really almost requires 1 or 2 dedicated people to it to make it actually work. Most companies will say no to that, but the reality is it will run at least 100 plus different security tests against it. It will remove the low-hanging fruit. And the big question I'll ask is a compromise worth it? If you run DAST and you're spending X for the tool and at least 1 or 2 resources versus the cost of a compromise from a ransomware event, from a data leakage event, or something else, which one's going to be cheaper for you? That's really going to be your defining factor.
I wish people can pitch it this way internally, because it's very hard sometimes to validate also the budget for that. Like that's where sometimes compliance helps, and having DAST as a checkbox in
It's
some way.
funny when you get compromised how that checkbook opens.
Yes, unfortunately, that's for a lot of things in security. Very funny how that. Yeah, the checkbox and the budget opens, and you can even open other checkboxes that you didn't know existed.
Right,
That
right, right.
that's why there's always like discussions, is compliance, checkbox or not as well. But hopefully, like at least I know in the EU a lot of it is changing, especially for financial organizations with DORA, for example, kind of place that mandates
Absolutely.
automated vulnerability testing. So I think in the US it's a little bit harder, but it depends. PCI DSS also helps there, but. Yeah, for companies that are not so, let's say, in the critical industries, it's much harder. But actually, those companies that we also hear a lot about in the media, and even during the Christmas break
Yes.
as well. But yeah, that's just how it is. And I always kind of rounded the podcast with one question: if there would be advice for someone with your experience, coming from your experience, who is just starting the application security program, someone young, how would you advise them to test internally to actually get, that as a part of their application security program?
Right. So my advice is don't give up, because it is something that takes a long time to get to. Getting into AppSec is really terribly tough to do. It takes a lot of effort, and the uplift on it. And again, the developers hate you. Kind of like QA, because to the developers you have that terrible relationship. But the reality is, don't give up. And I'll kind of throw this here. One of the things that I've always told new guys getting in, or gals, into security AppSec is know how to do some basic development skills. If you understand basic development, DAST will come a lot easier, because you understand what the web stuff is doing. And if you really want to get started and you don't know how to, go out and find an open source application that's out there on GitHub or wherever, and start contributing. Because when you do that, now you don't have to worry about getting hired as a developer. Now you have something that you can show and say, look, I'm part of this community. I'm a contributor. I can show you my own code and prove to you that I know how to do development. And again, kind of like I've said a couple times today, is when you start looking at AppSec, if you understand developers and understand development, it changes your whole perspective. When I go and give something from DAST over to the developers, I understand what it's going to take to implement. And if I understand something's going to be hard or tough to do, I understand that. And I'm not going to just throw it over the wall and say, hey, can you be done in 4 hours or 8 hours or something unrealistic? You can look at it and say, yeah, this is a cross-site scripting. The only thing they have to do is encoding. That's a really quick change. And when they understand development, they can explain to the developers how to fix it. Because if the developers don't know how to fix it, they're just going to continue repeating the same problem.
Yeah, I think that's when we never learn. If you never learn from, your mistakes because you didn't know about them, because someone else, is fix them for you, then it's just a vicious circle. So for sure, out of, the tools that would automatically fix everything, definitely at least should not, for now, exist. And if there would be one book that you could recommend for someone who wants to learn about security, what would it be?
Oh, there are so many books out there. I don't really have a favorite, because the reason why I say that is because it depends on what aspect of application security you're wanting to focus in on. And that really kind of would depend on, what kind of book I would recommend. There's hundreds of great books out there. Gosh, maybe one I'll throw out there that's actually for project management. It's called the Phoenix Project. And the reason why I throw the Phoenix Project out there is because you can learn how crazy of a life the developers have. And then when you understand some of those situations that they end up in, then it helps you understand how to better work with them. And so maybe the Phoenix Project, which is not an AppSec book, but it is a project management book that is incredibly amazing. It's great.
Okay, I'll put the link down in the description for that, and I really hope that someone be inspired and they will definitely read it. So thank you so much, Chris, on coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope you too. And let's hope if, for example, if someone from security team that doesn't have anyone with a development background will actually will either hire them or will get inspired and contribute to open source projects started. And especially it's very easy to start because there are so many little projects that exist.
Right.
You don't have to start with the most complicated one. And I will, at least I hope to see that as an outcome. Well, thank you so much, Chris. It was great having you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you, guys.